I would not have wanted to miss this session, which promises to be absolutely fascinating. We're going to be talking about devolution and policy innovation, and we could not have two better people to do that with. We have Nicola Sturgeon, the former First Minister of Scotland, and Mark Drakeford, former First Minister of Wales, two of the most experienced leaders in the UK and people who have had incredible experience of this question. So we're going to be talking about how they have found devolution has played a role in policy innovation in their countries, and we're also going to talk about the barriers to it as well, and some of the challenges to doing it effectively. There will be time for you all to ask your questions. We'll have 15 minutes or so, so please do prepare your questions as well. I'm going to start by asking both Nicola and Mark to give us an example of a policy innovation that happened because of devolution, because of the powers that they had as first leader of their country to do something different from what was being done in the UK previously. And I'm going to start with Nicola, if you could give us an example of that.
Thank you, and thank you for coming along to what I hope will be an interesting session. I'm going to do the kind of typical politician thing, and when I'm asked to give one example, I'm going to give two instead. And actually, I could give many, and we might get into more of them over the course of the discussion. But the two I'm going to give, one is a public health policy, one is a social welfare policy. The first is minimum unit pricing for alcohol, a policy that was introduced. I was health minister when we introduced it, although the alcohol industry dragged it through the courts for years. So I was first minister when it was implemented. And that was a policy that allowed us to introduce a very targeted initiative to deal with a long-standing problematic relationship that many people in Scotland have with the misuse of alcohol. And the policy is still, subject to assessment. These policies take a long time to properly assess, but I have little doubt that it will be shown to have bluntly saved lives in Scotland. So that is the first policy. Interestingly, I think if we were trying to introduce that policy today, and I'm getting ahead of the discussion right now, I think the Internal Market Act would give a Westminster government the ability to block it if they wanted, and I think that is an example of how the landscape has changed. The second example I would give is the Scottish Child Payment, which came about because of limited but important welfare powers that were devolved to the Scottish Parliament following the independence referendum, led to the establishment of Social Security Scotland, and has enabled the Scottish Government again to introduce targeted initiatives. The Scottish Child Payment to low-income families for every child in the family is the policy right now that is responsible for the fact that child poverty, still way too high in Scotland, is falling in Scotland, but still rising elsewhere in the UK. So these would be the two examples I would single out amongst many that we could talk about.
Thank you, Sam. Late one Tuesday night in 2014, after the longest debate in its history, the Senedd passed an organ donation bill in Wales, which changed the system of organ donation to a system of presumed consent, where it is assumed that you are willing to be an organ donor in the very, very rare circumstances where that is possible, unless you actively opt out of the system. It was a very controversial policy, controversial inside Wales. It was covertly, quite certainly, opposed by the UK government. Today, it is a policy in all parts of the United Kingdom. So it is an example of how a devolved legislature can innovate, can do something that is maybe difficult to do on a bigger scale, but where that innovation can lead to changes elsewhere.
And in both those cases, was it more to do with, how much was it to do with the different politics of the country versus the UK, and how much was it to do with the different policy environment that you were operating in as First Minister versus the kind of Westminster policy environment? Did that help get you to that example or other examples? What was more important?
In this example, I think policy is more important than politics. was my ambition when I was the Health Minister at the time to secure at least a 2/3 majority for that policy. And that meant that I had to have people in every single political party be prepared to vote for it. And with a great deal of hard work and compromise, then that is what was achieved. But I think there was a policy space that allowed us to do it. And one of the things I think about policy innovation is that the way it's sometimes talked about in public presses is that it's somehow a matter of a revelatory moment where something that's never been thought of suddenly happens. But actually changing government is not like that at all. It's normally the product of much longer gestation. And the Senedd had debated the change in the law for 6 years before it happened. There had been 2 committee inquiries, there had been countless statements and questions, and a moment arrives when it becomes possible to do something. But it is because of that careful preparation, that long-term investment in change, and it's about mobilising the right voices in favour of it. And actually, in this case, political voices were not the important voices. The important voices were the voices of families who'd either made that incredibly difficult decision to allow organ donation to happen as a loved one dies, or had been in receipt of it. And while you might say those people are not powerful actors in a traditional state system, they don't vote for anything, but actually in terms of policy innovation, their voices were the most important and powerful of all.
And what about you? What did you feel created the space for that policy innovation in Scotland?
I mean, I don't think we should underestimate. I agree with Mark. I think policy is more important in this context than politics. And where there might be politics, it's often not sort of party politics really at play. Although obviously party politics come into all of these issues. But I don't think we should sort of forget. Devolution's now, it's only been up and running for 25 years. It's still relatively young. But what created the space really was just suddenly having legislatures that had the time and the space to focus on issues and problems in our own areas of responsibility. Before devolution, and I think it's easy to forget this now, it was almost impossible, maybe with the exception of one piece of legislation a year, to get space on the Westminster agenda for Scottish-specific legislation, and it will have been the same for Wales-specific legislation. The first really chunky piece of legislation that the Scottish Parliament passed under a different administration to the one that is now was land reform. Land reform had been talked about in Scotland as a real, important priority for decades, but there was just never the time or the space on the Westminster agenda to get that done. So just having a legislature there to address the issues in Scotland or in Wales is a really important thing. And so all of the examples that I think I would talk about are examples of policy initiatives designed to address particular Scottish issues. Alcohol misuse is an issue across the UK, but a particular issue in Scotland that we were then able to deal with. I think in terms of maybe something that is more in the politics, but small p politics, and depending on your perspective, this could be seen as a good thing or a bad thing. There is a sense in certainly the Scottish Parliament that there's more of an appetite to do radical reforming stuff because we can. And critics of devolution would say, well, that becomes just doing things for its own sake, rather. And there is a danger it would become that, being different for the sake of it. But actually having that appetite to find the solutions because we can, because we've got the space and the ability to do that, in my view, is positive and a good thing.
What about some of the barriers? What would you have liked to have been able to do within a devolution settlement that you weren't able to do because it wasn't permitted or it wasn't possible to make it work? And you mentioned at the start, the sort of Internal Markets Act, has it got harder, do you think, to...
It's got way harder. And Mark will obviously have his own perspective on this, but him and I have been involved together when we were First Ministers in many of these discussions. So the barriers that have existed, from day one would be, I'm oversimplifying here, would be money. often the Scottish Parliament wants to do things, but because the purse strings are, still overall to a large extent held elsewhere, then the sort of misalignment between ambition and financing is a barrier. So too is the fact that there are many, many areas where there is a kind of mishmash of devolved and reserved responsibilities. So there's often not a sort of clear delineation. The Scottish, even in public health, the Scottish Parliament has responsibilities in some areas, but Westminster still holds it in others. So it can be very difficult to have a clear sense of where power and responsibility lies. What has changed, and I would date this to Brexit, has been, and I think two things came together. The replacement of the single market arrangements with the Internal Market Act has given Westminster much more ability to and potential to block things. I do believe, particularly maybe more arguable with the government in office in Westminster just now, but when the Tories were still in power, had we been trying to introduce minimum pricing then, I think they would have blocked it under the Internal Market Act. There is no doubt in my mind about that. And that has coincided, certainly in a Scottish context, with a much more, post the independence referendum, with a much more aggressive stance towards devolution, more of a willingness to use reserved Westminster powers than there ever was before. So, the Sewell Convention, the convention since the outset of devolution that says Westminster shouldn't legislate in devolved areas without the consent of the devolved parliaments. That convention was respected for 20 years, and then it was breached over Brexit and has been breached several times since. The use of Section 35 of the Scotland Act over, controversial legislation, okay, but doesn't take away from the point of principle over the Gender Recognition Act to block a piece of legislation. So that, much more aggressive stance that certainly was there in the latter part of, the Tory government, I don't think has gone away under the Labour government, but maybe there's just more of a hesitation there, is now, I think, a significant barrier. And if we continue to see reform gather strength, then I would be worried that will become more and more of an issue.
Well, look, I agree with Nicola that the climate for devolution is harder today than it was in the first 15 years of devolution. Some of that is that the inherent weaknesses of the devolution model, its reliance on convention, as in the Sewell Convention, rather than on entrenched legislation that defends the powers of devolved governments, has been more exposed in the post-Brexit era. Nevertheless, devolved governments do retain very powerful instruments in our own hands to proceed with policy innovation. You've got to be confident in using the capacity that you have and the mandates that you have to do the things that you were elected to do. And sometimes that will bring you up against the boundaries of devolution. So there are things we would have wanted to do which the devolution settlement prevents us from doing. You'll be interested to know that the reserve powers model for Wales, the UK government insisted on retaining powers over the Welsh hovercraft. So while we have powers over road and rail, and to a certain extent,
why?
Oh, well, I'd love to know. Wouldn't you? Well, I can tell you why. It's the inherent conservatism of the British state, in which the English or the Westminster model is regarded as the model, and anything else has to be justified as a departure from it. And Brexit, COVID was very much that there was a decision made in London, and if you wanted to do anything different, you were expected to explain why you were doing something different, rather than explaining that you were doing something with the powers you had because it was right in the place that you represented. So, there are significant headwinds in the face of devolution still today, but that shouldn't deny the fact that we're still able to do things that would never be done in London, because the politics is different and the scale is different, the constraints and barriers are different as well, and we're able to get on and do them.
What do you think would help break down that still entrenched scepticism about devolution, which is, as you say, perhaps hardening again, having softened a bit? What is it about the way Westminster works that makes it so difficult to make the argument for devolution? I've had experience with this myself. I wrote a book last year in which I argued for more devolution within England, and you get a lot of pushback, and you say, but this isn't working very well here, so why are we so determined to keep this model? What would change that view?
Well, I actually think that English devolution is probably the single biggest thing that would change all of that, because actually it is much, much easier to work with Scotland or Northern Ireland, because the scale is much more comparable, and you're dealing with governments that have broadly a similar set of powers that you have and can use. Many of the things that we would wish to do are much more negotiable, I think, with an English region rather than with the English government. So in terms of policy innovation, I think the most radical thing that we've done during this Senedd term are the things we've done in relation to second homes and levelling the playing field between people who want to live in those communities as opposed to people who have deep pockets who can buy up properties and visit them occasionally. Now, that is an issue in Cornwall, it's an issue in the Lake District, it's an issue in Bridlington, but it's not an issue in other parts of England. So I think if we had a coherent form of devolution within England, then that would change the dynamic, because many of the relationships that Wales would want to have would not be with England, that huge, enormous neighbour sitting on our doorstep, which is hard to engage with, but we would engage much more on that regional level where there are interests in common and policy possibilities that we might be able to work on together.
Would you agree with that? And if so, what advice would you give to the Westminster government sort of pushing a devolution bill through at the moment in terms of what that should look like in an English regions context versus Scotland or Wales?
I'm not sure the best way to achieve English devolution is for me to start giving advice to the Westminster government on it. That might sort of stop it in its tracks. I think I do agree with Mark. I think, as a kind of outsider looking in, I think England would benefit hugely from much greater devolution. The form of that might not be uniform, and fundamentally it's for regions within England to decide, what works best. I think, mayors, city mayors like Andy Burnham have been, hugely powerful in terms of putting the interests of the areas they represent much higher up the agenda and achieving real change. So I think there's models there that could be extended. I mean, in terms of what drives these attitudes and what might change these attitudes, I mean, I agree with Mark that for the devolved parliaments, the most important thing is just to get on and do the things that you want to do and use the powers and the levers that we have, and in a sense, continue until apprehended sort of thing, and then fight the battles then. I mean, there are obviously big P political issues influencing attitudes to devolution, and there's no point in pretending otherwise. But often, within the Whitehall machine, and it's not meant to be critical of civil servants, they're, stretched thinly. But in my experience, when you have issues with sort of Westminster, it often comes from not a deliberate attempt to, stymie what the Scottish Government wanted to do, but just a lack of understanding of devolution, a lack of willingness to really develop that understanding, a lack of time to develop that. That's not uniform across Whitehall, but some departments are better than others. But there is still that sense of, for a lot of civil servants, they've got no real idea of what devolved powers are or how they interact with what they're trying to do. And the last point I would make here, picking up on something Mark said, there is still a mindset in Whitehall that the Westminster way is the kind of default way, and anybody departing from that has to justify why they're departing. So, during COVID, for example, there were many, many, many examples of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland kind of doing the same thing. England was doing something different, and yet we were the ones that were always described as departing from what the Westminster government was doing. because it was seen as the kind of default way of doing it, and we all had to then, justify why we were doing something different. So I think there's, putting aside issues of, ill will or malign political motivation, which, is just, has to be kind of dealt with in that sphere. I think it is about changing mindset and civil servants in Whitehall taking the time to understand devolution and therefore how we all have to work together within that context.
I mean, one of the examples of this kind of conservatism that you're both talking about when it comes to letting go is fiscal devolution and giving Scotland, Wales the power to raise money, which is now, I think, a big issue in the context of English devolution as well. We've got mayors arguing for at least being able to raise tourist taxes, if not wider taxes as well. The Treasury are very resistant to that idea. That obviously has come in to some degree now in Scotland. What sort of changed their mind, and what would you like to see in terms of going further with that? What would be the arguments that could help get you where you need to get next? And what are the barriers that's been created by not having more fiscal power?
I mean, I don't want to strike too much of a pessimistic note here, because I think it's important to stay optimistic and to stay very forward-looking about devolution. But I don't see, definitely wasn't the case under the last Westminster administration, and I don't see it under this one. I don't see much of a political appetite right now to advance devolution or to, resolve some of the inherent tensions with it. And I hope that will change, but I'm not hugely optimistic about that at the moment. What prompted, so after the independence referendum, Scotland got, not complete but substantial power over income tax and much greater welfare powers. They have both been put to good use. Another example of using devolution, the income tax system in Scotland is different to the UK. It's more, in my view, it's more progressive. Other people take a different view, but that's my view. We've raised additional revenue, which has been hugely helpful in trying to, even at the margins, shield against austerity politics. We have used welfare powers. I already mentioned the Scottish Child Payment. One of the problems there is, and this is becoming an increasing issue for the Scottish Government and will become increasingly unsustainable, and it was one of the real problems in the Scotland Act that followed the independence referendum. We effectively in Scotland have unlimited power to create any welfare benefit we want, but we don't have corresponding power to raise the revenue to support it. So what you have in Scotland is a sort of public expectation that the Scottish Government can mitigate any welfare decision that the UK Government takes, that we can create any benefit to tackle poverty that we want, which we do in terms of the policy making side, but we still have very, very limited revenue raising powers. And so what do we need? We need to see, even putting aside my constitutional preference, we need to see more of an alignment between the ability to make policy and the ability to raise the revenue to support that policy. Only having one substantial income tax lever puts far too much onus on that particular tax. And I was the first minister who first reformed the income tax system, increased income tax at the top level. Bluntly, we've gone probably as far as we sustainably can on income tax in Scotland. So without a greater basket of tax levers, that misalignment and unsustainability is going to become ever more acute.
Well, Sam, I'll tell you the sad story of the vacant land tax. So in 2017, the Conservative government put a new Government of Wales Act on the statute book, and it created a mechanism for Wales to be able to draw down powers to create new taxes for Wales. I was the finance minister at the time, and I wanted to test this new machinery. So I thought I would look for an idea that was small enough and uncontentious enough to send it round this circuit so we could test how it would work, and then having got the machinery to work, we'd have other bigger ideas. So we set the vacant land tax off. So it's an idea that we had adopted from the Republic of Ireland, where it's already in use, and it allows a government to raise money where land is either being land banked or where land is vacant and not being put to productive use, And it's a behavioural tax as much as a revenue-raising tax, because what you want to do is to incentivise owners of that land to bring it into beneficial use for local communities and public purposes. Well, we sent it off round that circuit. And believe me, it's still there somewhere. And, you know, the closest we got was under one of the Conservative Chief Secretaries to the Treasury, and then came the Johnson...
No, damn that much. There were quite a lot of them.
Yeah, no, they were. Indeed, it was Archie Norman. In fact, so it was under Theresa May. Then came the Johnson block on anything that was to be devolved. And I'm afraid, you know, over 12 months into the new government, it sits there still in the Treasury, because the Treasury is by itself the single greatest barrier to policy innovation in the United Kingdom. And that idea, that tiny little idea, sits there today. And I think in the next Senate term, what we will do is we will solve the problem in a different way, because we can provide local authorities in Wales with that power to do it. Now, I believe it would be better done on a country as small as Wales on a once for Wales basis. But as we've just legislated for a visitor levy, and we've done that, that's on the statute book now, but it's a power for local government to introduce it. We will introduce a vacant land tax as a power for local government to do that. And there are other ideas that otherwise remain blocked at this end of the M4 that we will liberate in that way.
The Treasury is the biggest blocker to policy innovation.
I mean, I 100% agree with that.
Feels like we're starting a whole other session here. I have views on that topic too. I'm going to come to the audience in a second, so get your questions ready. I've got one more question I wanted to ask before I do that, which is about sort of policy borrowing between the nations. And I mean, from my experiences working in education, I often found it, as a policymaker, quite frustrating that there was this sort of resistance between the different countries, between England, Scotland, Wales, about taking ideas from other countries, a sort of not invented here syndrome, and a sort of lack of communication between policymakers in the different countries about even what was going on elsewhere. Did you feel that? Is it possible to break that down?
Well, I completely share that frustration, because look, there are two models of how you think about devolution. The dominant model in the United Kingdom is a competitive model. We are somehow forever competing with one another to demonstrate that we are better than somebody else at something. And I think that is a completely destructive model in terms of policy learning and policy innovation. What you really want is a view of devolution as a set of policy experiments. Mm-hmm. The fact that we can try something and we can learn from others who've done it already. I had a really excellent conversation just last weekend with the Minister in the Scottish Government, Kate Forbes, responsible for the Gaelic language, and with colleagues from Northern Ireland about ways in which we are all trying to support Indigenous languages in our nations. And it was all about learning from one another and sharing ideas and looking at what's been tried and failed and looking at how we can do things better. That approach to devolution, the living laboratory approach to devolution, I think is the way in which policy innovation can be liberated. And the competitive, the league table model, in which, people are forever trying to say, oh, look, Wales is worst at this, or somebody else is better at that. I think that's very destructive of innovation, learning, and in the end, better policy formulation.
I mean, I agree with that. I think, in my experience, I think from what Mark said there, he might agree. I think the willingness to learn between the devolved administrations has actually always been really good. I mean, Organ donation being a case in point, we've learned lots from Wales, copied things that were being done in Wales. I think the cooperation between our civil services was always really good. I think there's more of a resistance to that, and I think in the relationship between Westminster and the devolved administrations. I think, if a bit of healthy competition is about raising the game overall, I think it's always got a role to play somewhere. If, we want to aim to be matching you on this, but I agree with Mark that if that just becomes a sort of standoff of a refusing to learn from each other, then that is destructive, and it's not the kind of model of devolution I think that serves people well.
I'm going to come to questions from the floor. Please, can you tell us where you're from and who you are? And I don't know if there are microphones. There are microphones. It's just at the back there by the curtain.
Diolch, Jacob Ellis from the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales' office. Diolch I chi ysgrifennydd am eich cyfraniad chi. Dwi'n awyddus trafod deddf llesiant cenedlaethau dyfodol, dy ddim yn surprise I chi. Very keen to discuss the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which marks its 10th anniversary this year. In a room full of policymakers and policy influencers, I wondered, could I invite you, Mark, just to give an illustration, a reflection on that important piece of legislation?
Wel, diolch yn fawr, diolch am y cwestiwn, diolch am y cyfle I wneud y cyfraniad. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is often thought of as the single most radical piece of legislation passed by the Senedd. It requires policy makers and decision makers in the Welsh Government, but in local authorities and elsewhere, when you're faced with a decision, to ask yourself not simply what difference will this make today, but what difference will this decision make to people who will come after us and live with the consequences of this decision. I'm often asked to give examples of it, and I will give one example in a moment, but I don't think that is the real test. The real test is in the culture, the change culture that question brings about. And I'm very confident, having been in the Welsh Government before and since that legislation, that it does change the culture. It does require you every time you see something. It requires the civil service to give you advice on that as well. It's a balance, always. There's no, the Act doesn't solve policy problems for you, but it does change the way you approach it. So to give you my one example, probably the first really big decision that I had to make when I became First Minister was a decision on whether or not to give the go-ahead to a new 6-lane M4 relief road around the city of Newport in South East Wales. There's no doubt at all there have been major traffic difficulties around the city, and there had been a long plan in the making to create a relief road. I think every expectation was that the Welsh Government would give the go-ahead to it. It was powerfully supported by transport lobbies, by the local authority, by industry and so on. And after an enormous amount of thought and reading and things, I decided not to give it the go-ahead. And the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act was very influential in that decision, because I'm faced with a decision which tells me that pieces of the Welsh landscape that have been there for 2,000 years, ancient monuments, ancient woodland, where 2,000 years worth of the Welsh population has seen and enjoyed those things, that those things are going to be obliterated. And in the end, I thought to myself, I think the obligation to future generations to go on enjoying things that have been such an established part of our history and our heritage outweighs the immediate advantage of a policy solution which in many ways has been tried and failed for 70 years and more, which is to think that the answer to traffic is always to build more roads. So there is an example of where the Act made a very practical and actually very high-profile difference in policy making.
Got a question at the front here from the lady in the orange. There's a microphone just coming to you.
Thank you, Borda. Diolch. It's good to see a Welsh contingent here today. The first thing I want to say is thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. I really have. My question is about local devolution within the nations of Wales and Scotland. We focus quite a lot on national powers through this conversation. And without having a particular point of view, I'm interested in your own assessment of the extent to which your respective governments have grappled with and embraced local devolution within your respective nations, and the extent to which you are then able to use local devolution as engines of innovation that then inform successful national policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a brilliant question, and if I'm being really candid, I think this sort of devolution from Edinburgh down to localities in Scotland is something that I didn't do enough on as First Minister, because I think inevitably in the earlier days of devolution, there's a kind of tendency to do the opposite, almost to pool the powers, because suddenly you've got these new, legislatures that want to hold the powers themselves, and I think there has been that impact. I think there's also again, small p political media issue at play here, where, certainly it's the case in Scotland. I don't know if Mark would identify with this in Wales, but you take education, for example. It's a local council responsibility in Scotland, and yet it's Scottish Government ministers that will get hit over the head for everything that goes wrong in the education system. So when you feel you are being held to account for something, then you want to kind of take the powers to yourself to try to deal with it. So I think there's a bit of an issue there. I mean, there are some great examples in Scotland of really local decision making that almost has gone over the head of local authorities to communities. Participatory budgeting, for example, there's a great example of that in my own constituency, putting relatively small amounts of money into the hands of community councils, and where that is well implemented, it's not always well implemented, but where it is, that can be really transformational. So I think there is a need to do much, much more of that, and to sort of resist this temptation to pull the powers to the centre. I think it's a fair criticism, certainly in a Scottish context, that while the Scottish Parliaments demand more powers from Westminster, we are not as good as we should be at giving those powers further down the line.
Well, I absolutely recognise the dilemma that Nicola points to. If you're a small nation and you're a minister, you will be asked questions about things which could not possibly be anything that you had an influence over, but nevertheless, you're the minister, so you're expected to know why the porridge was late being delivered on Ward 4 in a Sturgeon license.
And that is exactly the kind of question you get asked.
Yeah, you do, indeed. But the answer to the question, I think, how far have we grappled with it? I think the answer is insufficiently. Now, I think there are some more promising recent examples. So I think our visitor levy is a local tax. It is a power for local government, for localities to decide if it's useful to them. The powers we've introduced in relation to second homes are local powers. They're not the Welsh Government exercising them. They are for local authorities to take account of the needs of their own areas and things. But, I think Nicola is right. It's sort of inevitable, isn't it, in the first period of a new institution, that it tends to be focused on what it itself can do and some of its very big relations with other parts of the United Kingdom. And I hope a maturing devolution will see that actually those relationships that the Senedd has, not just with principal councils, but with town and community councils as well, who often do fantastically good stuff in Wales, that those relationships also need as much attention.
We've got time for one more question, so I'm just going to come to the lady here.
Hi, I'm Catherine from PolicyWise. We're a comparative policy institute. I had a question, really, which is slightly cheeky, as a plug for a session we're running this afternoon into intergovernmental relations, and we hope to see you all there. But really, I wanted to know how important you thought those formal structures were. So the kind of formal meetings, the intergovernmental discussions that happen at that level, and more importantly, what do you think needs to be done to make them work better?
I think Mark and I could keep you here for the rest of the day, sharing our pain. I mean, our response probably tells you everything you need to know. I mean, the structures are really, really important, and they've never worked perfectly, to be honest. But I think one of the things I learned is no matter how good or bad these structures are, if they're not peopled by individuals who want to make them work, then they're not going to work. And how much, I don't know, I suspect both of us spent more hours than we ever wanted to on trying to reform the intergovernmental, frameworks and get them to work better. I think they probably are better in theory now than they were before. But fundamentally, you need that mindset to be right to make them work, would be my overall reflection.
Yeah, so exactly that. They're necessary but not sufficient. Without them, you can't get things done. So it is important that there are functioning intergovernmental forms of getting around the table and discussing things. But if they are entirely formulaic, and by goodness, have we not sat in meetings where the meeting was a fiction, designed to satisfy a press release, then
Yes, we are talking about you, Theresa May.
then those institutional relationships aren't working. So they are necessary. Without them, you can't do things. You've got to be able to go beyond just the formalities.
I think a fiction designed to support a press release is a good description of most cabinet meetings as well.
I mean, a lot of these, the joint ministerial committees, and I mean, for large chunks of our times in office, they just didn't meet. And then when they would meet, it literally would be, you would sit around the cabinet table in Downing Street, and it would be just going through a formulaic agenda. There would be the press release at the end of it, and nothing, literally nothing, would have been influenced, and certainly nothing would have been changed as a result.
Usually the press release before it.
The press release before it, that's right, yeah. Yeah.
Well, on that insight into how Whitehall works, we will finish the session. Please, can you join me in giving a huge thanks to Nicola Sturgeon